Rain battered the cracked leather of my boots as I trudged down the unlit shoulder of Oak Haven Road. It was mid-November in Oregon, the kind of wet, bone-deep cold that doesn't just chill your skin but seems to freeze the marrow. For 3 months, I had been living out of my 2008 Honda Civic after the medical bills for my mother's sudden passing devoured my savings, my credit, and ultimately, my apartment. 2 days ago, the bank had repossessed the car while I was inside a diner begging for a glass of tap water. I was 26, entirely alone, and officially out of options. My name is Chloe Bennett, and until that night, I believed the universe simply didn't care whether I lived or died. Through the sheets of driving rain, I saw it. 420 Tiv, Oak Haven. It was a massive, rotting Victorian estate set far back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown blackberry brambles and dying ivy. Locals whispered about the place. It had belonged to a man named Thomas Scott, an eccentric who vanished without a trace back in 2014. The property had been tied up in probate hell ever since, left to rot. The windows on the first floor were boarded up, but the wood on the side door looked splintered and weak. Survival overrides fear. I pushed through the thigh-high wet weeds, my teeth chattering so violently my jaw ached. I reached the side door and threw my shoulder against it. Once, twice. On the third try, the rusted deadbolt tore free from the rotted door frame, and I stumbled inside, falling onto a floor thick with dust and dead leaves. It was pitch black and smelled of mildew and stale air, but it was dry. I clicked on a small cheap pen light I kept in my jacket pocket. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a kitchen frozen in time. A ceramic mug sat on the counter beside a rusted spoon. A newspaper from October 2014 lay yellowed on a dusty oak table. I dragged myself into the main living room. A heavy canvas tarp covered a large sectional sofa. I pulled it back, grateful for the pristine, dry fabric underneath, and collapsed. I wrapped myself in the tarp, shivering uncontrollably, praying for sleep to take me before the cold did. Hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I knew if my core temperature dropped any further, I might not wake up. I needed a blanket. Desperation pushed me back to my feet. I aimed my dying penlight toward the grand staircase. The steps groaned under my weight, each creak echoing like a gunshot in the silent, empty house. The second floor was a long hallway of closed doors. I opened the first, a bathroom, dry rot covering the floor. The second, an empty guest room. The third door, located at the very end of the hall, was locked. It wasn't just a standard bedroom lock. It was a heavy, commercial-grade deadbolt installed on a heavy oak door. Why would someone put a vault lock on a bedroom inside their own home? I went back downstairs, grabbed a heavy iron poker from the living room fireplace, and returned. I jammed the iron tip into the gap between the door and the frame and threw all my body weight backward. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and the door swung open. Inside was not a bedroom. It was an office, but unlike the rest of the house, there was no dust. The air felt heavy and stagnant, but the room was meticulously organized. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center. Behind it, a wall of filing cabinets. I moved behind the desk, hoping to find a spare jacket or blanket left in a chair. Instead, my penlight caught the corner of a corkboard on the wall. The beam illuminated a web of red string connecting dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and financial records. I stepped closer, wiping the lens of my flashlight, thinking my exhausted brain was hallucinating. Right in the center of the board was a photograph of a woman smiling at a camera, standing outside a bakery. My breath hitched in my throat. I dropped the iron poker. It hit the floor with a heavy clatter. The woman in the photograph was my mother, Evelyn Bennett. My hands shook as I reached out and touched the glossy paper. It was a candid shot, taken secretly from across the street. Next to it was a photo of me and I looked to be about 19, carrying textbooks across my community college campus. Below that were copies of my mother's bank statements, her life insurance policy, and the deed to our family home. Thomas Scott wasn't just an eccentric recluse. He had been watching us. But why? I frantically pulled open the top drawer of the desk. It was stuffed with manila folders. I grabbed the one labeled Project Phoenix, Hayes. I sat on the floor, the cold completely forgotten, as my eyes scanned the typed pages. Thomas Scott had been a private investigator. According to the notes, he hadn't been hired to watch my mother. He had been hired to watch her business partner, Richard Hayes. Richard and my mother had co-owned a mid-sized logistics company. Growing up, I knew Uncle Richard as a charismatic, wealthy man who always brought me expensive gifts on my birthday. When my mother died in a tragic single-car accident on a Rains Lake highway, Richard had handled everything. He wept at her funeral. He told me the company was drowning in debt and that he was buying out her half for pennies, just to save me from bankruptcy. I believed him. The documents in my lap told a terrifyingly different story. Scott's logs detailed months of surveillance showing Richard systematically embezzling millions from the company through offshore shell accounts. My mother had found out. Scott had recorded a phone call, transcribed on a yellow legal pad, where my mother threatened to go to the police. The next page was a mechanic's report. Scott had broken into the police impound lot after my mother's fatal crash. He had photographed the brake lines of her SUV. They hadn't failed due to wear and tear. They had been deliberately severed. Richard had murdered my mother, stolen her life's work, and left me destitute. But the twisted reality didn't stop there. As I read Scott's final entry, dated October 12, 2014, the day before he vanished, my blood ran completely cold. Scott hadn't gathered this evidence to help my mother. He had gathered it to blackmail Richard Hayes. Hayes agreed to the drop. The final entry read, $2 million in bearer bonds, or I send the brake line photos to the DA. Meeting him tonight at the docks. If I don't come back, it's because Hayes didn't want to play ball. I've left the backup drives in the floor safe. Thomas Scott never came back. Richard had killed him too. And for 10 years, the evidence capable of destroying Richard Hayes had been sitting in this abandoned house, waiting for someone to find it. I scrambled under the desk. Sure enough, beneath a faux Persian rug, there was a dial safe set into the floorboards. Scott's files had the combination casually scribbled in the margins of a ledger. 34-12-58. My frozen fingers clumsily spun the dial. Click. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside lay 2 encrypted USB drives, a stack of original offshore bank records with Richard's signatures, and a microcassette tape labeled Confession. I grabbed my ragged backpack and started shoving the evidence inside. This was my life back. This was justice for my mother. I zipped the bag shut and stood up, ready to run straight to the FBI field office in Portland. Then I heard it, the crunch of tires on wet gravel outside. I froze, killing my pen light instantly. I crept to the window, peering through a crack in the heavy velvet drapes. A black Lincoln Navigator had pulled up the overgrown driveway. The headlights cut through the rain. 2 men in dark raincoats stepped out. One of them was holding a heavy crowbar. The other was holding a suppressed handgun. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Had they seen my flashlight? Or was Richard Hayes still keeping tabs on this property, waiting for the day he could finally tear it down and destroy the evidence for good? Front door secure. A gruff voice echoed faintly from outside. Check the side. Panic threatened to blind me. As they found the splintered side door, they would know someone was inside. If they found me in this room, surrounded by Scott's files, they would put a bullet in my head and bury me in the basement. Side doors busted open, the second voice called out. Somebody's in there. Clear the house. Shoot first. Ask questions later. Mr. Hayes wants this place sterilized by morning. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold downstairs. The floorboards creaked. They were sweeping the ground floor. I had less than 2 minutes before they came upstairs. I looked around the dark office. The door I had broken open couldn't be locked again. There was no fire escape, but there was a heavy oak window frame overlooking the sloping roof of the wraparound porch. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, pulled the brass latch on the window, and heaved upward. It shrieked in protest, the rusted hinges scraping loudly. Upstairs, a voice yelled from the bottom of the steps. I squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling out onto the slick, moss-covered shingles of the porch roof. The freezing rain immediately soaked through my clothes, but adrenaline pushed the cold away. I scrambled on hands and knees to the edge of the roof, ignoring the tearing of my jeans and the sharp pain in my palms. Behind me, the office door was kicked open, the beam of a tactical flashlight sweeping the room. She went out the window. I didn't hesitate. I dropped from the porch roof, falling 12 feet into the thick blackberry bushes below. Thorns tore at my face and arms, but I bit down on my lip to stifle a scream. I rolled out of the brush, got my feet under me, and ran blindly into the woods bordering the property. There, in the trees, a muffled puff sounded over the rain, and bark exploded off a pine tree inches from my head. I ducked low, zigzagging through the dense timber. The darkness was my only ally. I ignored the burning in my lungs and the branches whipping against my eyes. I ran until I couldn't hear their shouts, until I couldn't see the beams of their flashlights, until my legs gave out completely, and I collapsed on the side of the main highway, a mile from the house. At 6 a.m., soaked in mud, blood, and freezing rain, I walked through the double-glass doors of the state police headquarters. The desk sergeant looked at me like I was a ghost. "I need to speak to a detective," I rasped, dropping my heavy backpack onto the counter. "I have evidence of a double homicide." Detective Arthur Gable was a hardened, skeptical man, but as he plugged the USB drives into an isolated terminal and reviewed the offshore accounts and the photos of my mother's severed brake lines, the color drained from his face. By noon, he wasn't looking at me like a vagrant anymore. He was looking at me like a survivor. The raid on Richard Hayes' estate happened the following morning. He was arrested at his country club midway through a round of golf. They found the men from the Lincoln Navigator on his payroll, and under interrogation, one of them flipped. He led the police to an abandoned well on a property Hayes owned, where they recovered the remains of Thomas Scott. The fallout was catastrophic for Hayes. The financial records proved he had stolen over $7 million from my mother's estate. The murder charges ensured he would never see the outside of a cell again. It took 8 months of relentless legal battles, but the courts returned what was rightfully mine. The embezzled funds were traced and seized, and my mother's company was restored to my name. Today, I live in a quiet, modern home overlooking the water. I am secure, warm, and safe, but sometimes, when the November rain lashes against the glass, I am pulled back to that freezing night. I remember the smell of decay, the rusted lock, and the desperate leap into the dark. I went into that abandoned house expecting to die quietly, forgotten by the world. Instead, I found the truth hidden in the shadows, and in the process, I found the strength to take my life back.